That was a really fast lunchtime. I just want to pick up on a few things about this particular model. There were some good questions that were asked as people were filing out to lunch. And one that I thought was very important, that is, someone asked me, what is like the sort of one simplest, most important thing to stress or concentrate on when it comes to this particular model? I think the single most hopeful avenue for trying to renew a congregation or to change an institution is actually this one down here, that emphasis on intentional practice. Because it's right in the middle, and it appeals to people who have highly formed postmodern worldviews, and yet it is also a language that modernist sort of churchgoers can understand. And it brings together, or helps even to dissolve in some cases, the tension between liberal and conservative. I think you guys have a pretty interesting example of this in your own denomination, and that is two really large churches that are Methodist churches. I think you could easily see Church of the Resurrection in Kansas as being a more, moderately liberal Methodist church, and it is highly intentional. They pay so much attention to practice there. And then you could look at Ginghamsburg, which is what I would call moderately conservative Methodist church, and they also pay extraordinary attention to Christian practice. And it's interesting that the pastors, for example, have become partners in a lot of concerns related to the renewal of Methodism, not because they're just pastors of large churches, but because they actually do share a passion for Christian practice. And I have spoken, I'm actually friends with Adam Hamilton, and I've spoken at Ginghamsburg, which is interesting that Ginghamsburg has invited me, but Resurrection hasn't. I kind of wonder about that. But it's really kind of fascinating to see the level of friendship and relationality that can develop between different kinds of theological approaches to Christianity when the focus is on practice. And I just think that pathway is one of the best potential pathways for renewing local congregations. And then the same person who asked the question asked me if I had written about that, and I said that I have. And some of you probably have read that book. It was a book called Christianity for the Rest of Us. And if you haven't read it and you're interested in this model and helpful ways to move a congregation into this model, Christianity for the Rest of Us does that without talking about the model, by just emphasizing Christian practices. And so I actually think that's one of the best paths of change. Sometimes leaders can understand these kinds of frameworks, and yet people who are in congregations don't necessarily need to know the difference between a modernist and a postmodernist in order to create a vital, vibrant congregation. But what they do have to do is they have to be able to offer hospitality. They have to be able to practice forgiveness. And they have to be able to know how to pray and to engage in theological reflection. And so if you take care with those simple things, I think that gets us a long way. And that's one of the reasons also why I was so happy when I was told about your conference choosing the book People's History of Christianity. Now that you see the model, you actually can guess where some of that book came from. Here I was working with these congregations that were moving on this journey from conventional church to intentional church. And one of the things that I discovered was all of the church histories we have are about institutions and sort of conventional structures of church. And I thought to myself, gosh, it would be a great thing if people who are in congregations could have a easy to read guide about the history and tradition of Christian practice, so that it wasn't something that was scary or new, but that they could see how these practices are a deep part of our faith, and that it's not some sort of program that somebody cooks up, but that it's actually the Christian tradition over time. And it's a good thing when people understand that tradition changes over time. And that's what that book was about, to teach people about Christian practice, to help them understand the intentionality of practice, and also so that they could feel that they were part of a larger story when they are engaging in practice, that it's not just some sort of the latest, greatest church growth program, because it's not that. It's a way of life in community. So those two books might help you quite a bit as you sort of think about this model and how it works in congregations. Now, for what we have at hand, this model is really a model that helps us to understand our institutional life. And you can, I can go through the Episcopal Church, for example, and I could name, groups and people who still think that the liberal conservative argument is the most important thing and act as if that is the only argument or the only discussion we have in the church. And then I can think about people who really have gotten this whole point about conventionality and intentionality and are working to move structures and processes and programs and theological education, all kinds of things in a direction towards practice. And so this is a very lively pole in the Episcopal Church. And then we have this third area here where there's a lot of talk. We're actually quite far along in working with thinking about emerging congregations and new ways of shaping community, and even questions of ordination of ministers and some other things fall along this trajectory here. So you can see all these different kinds of things functioning in churches, and this is helpful when we're trying to sort through those. But there's something else that's going on at the exact same time, and that is, as everybody in this room is well aware, we live in a time of enormous cultural change. And so while we're having these discussions and trying to think about what our denominations and what our congregations are like related to a model like this, the culture is just zooming ahead like this. And like we're beginning to get, as I said at the end of the time we had this morning, we're almost beginning to get this distance between what is a very good model and a place we need to do a lot of work, but also a distance between us and the world. So this afternoon, I would like to pick up on that. I'm going to put my Tinker Toys down and talk a little bit more about what's happening in the world around the church. And this is a question that I begin to engage, and we can have the slides, my slides up, please. That I begin to engage in a very strong way in my most recent book. It's called Christianity After Religion. The subtitle terrified some friends of mine, The End of Church and the Birth of a New Spiritual Awakening. And what I meant by the end of church was the end of conventionally organized church. And so that's, I'm not talking that all the churches are going to close or something horrible like that. You're all going out of business. There's no pension fund left. That's what everybody always says to me, just the pension fund. For what it's worth, I once heard Stanley Hauerwas say, long after Christianity is dead and gone, the United Methodist Church will still be paying its pensions. It was a great quote. I thought to myself, oh my gosh, Stanley Hauerwas is a card. Since I went to Duke, I have Hauerwas. I have a lot of Hauerwas stories. But anyway, this is a book that I wrote in 2012. And some people asked me, they said, oh gosh, this book is so different than some of your other books. It was a little hard for me to engage. Well, it's only because it's not really all that different at all. But I was shifting the conversation away from institutional church concerns towards the world. And I was beginning to ask the question of how it is that trends and things that are out in society are pushing us and pulling us and asking new questions of us and what does it mean to be Christian in this changing culture. And so the first 3 chapters of this book are all about trends and cultural change. And in those 3 chapters, which several of my readers have written to me and told me are very difficult for them to read, but in those first 3 chapters, I show how conventionally organized religious institutions are all in trouble, and try to also show patterns of where vitality could be emerging, especially around the language of spiritual but not religious and some other language like that. When I was working on this book, I did not have a chart that I'm about to show you, and it's this chart that I want to share with you this afternoon. I have to set it up for a moment before I flip over to it, because otherwise it scares people. It is not a chart that is specifically about church or specifically about faith. It's actually a political chart. It was a chart that fell into my hands on the Friday after the last presidential election. So my book was published in February of 2012, and I got this chart in November of 2012. And the context of the chart is incredibly important. It was produced by an organization called Public Religion Research. And Public Religion Research is dedicated, and it's a great outfit. They're dedicated to figuring out the best sort of analysis of the relationship between religion and politics in the United States today. And it's a nonpartisan group. They're very good at what they do. They went and had a survey right after the second election of President Obama, and they took that survey data and combined it with exit polling data in order to create the chart that I'm about to show you that helps you see the religious coalitions, the way religion and politics intersected in the choosing of the last presidential candidate, or the last president. So there's a line for Governor Romney that's a red line, and there's a line for President Obama that's a blue line. And I'll explain that more as we get it, but I wanted you to know that it is a political chart. I am not trying to sell you on either one of these candidates or either one of these political parties. Although anybody who reads my books knows which one I personally favor, because I'm not shy. But it's not that kind of chart. It is a chart about analysis. It was presented at the National Press Club in a large event where there were about 250 people present that were members of the media from across the world. There were also people in that room who were Republican and Democratic staffers to different House members. And there were people who worked in both liberal and conservative think tanks who were talking about this when it came out. And it is an astonishing thing. You can see the title of the chart is The End of a White Christian Strategy Among Voters. And I will explain that as we look. Just at first, I just want you to look at the blue and the red lines. You can see the blue line are all the people who voted for President Obama, and the red line represents all the people who voted for Governor Romney. And each one of those colors represents a different religious group. And so the beige color represents unaffiliateds. People who answer on surveys, what religion are you? Those are the people who say none of the above. The 3 orange colors in the center of the chart represent what we could understand to be sort of the historic core of religion in the United States. That is white, European background Protestants and Catholics. And the Protestants are divided into evangelicals and mainliners. And so those 3 colors, okay, I always have to check and make sure I got it right. White evangelical Protestants are represented by the darkest orange. Mainliners, where you put the United Methodist Church, they're represented by the medium color orange. And white Roman Catholics are represented by the light orange color. And then you have, on the far side of the chart, 4 shades of green. And that green area is the area of racial and religious pluralism in the United States. And so there you have several Christian groups. You have Hispanic Catholics, and this chart says other Catholics, and that also includes Black Catholics and Asian Catholics in that category. So you have Hispanic and Black and Asian Catholics. And then you have Black Protestants, which are pulled out in that distinctive color green category. Those are Christian groups. And then you have a category that's kind of funky, a lighter green color, that says other Christian. And that includes Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, Eastern Orthodox Christians, people who say they're Christians but don't give any other kind of identifying information. It also includes Hispanic Pentecostals or Korean Presbyterians. And so ethnic Protestant groups are in that category. And then you have a far category of very light green, and that's other world religions. And so that's everybody else: Jews, Hindus, Muslims, Buddhists, Sikhs, etc. And those are the standard kind of 8 big categories that survey takers have been tracking for years to try to figure out how Americans talk about themselves when they give a religious identity. So here we can see it for these 2 presidential candidates. Of the people who voted for President Obama, 25% of the president's voters were beige people, were religiously unaffiliated. And then you get to those classic orange categories in the middle, and you can see what the numbers are there. 8% of the president's voters were white evangelical Protestants, 13% were white mainline Protestants, and 13% were white Roman Catholics. And then the line kind of expands again when you hit the green categories, and you have 10% of the people who voted for the president were Hispanic or Asian or Black Catholics. 16% were Black Protestants, not a huge surprise there. 9%, and I said that category includes Mormons, interestingly enough, 9% were other Christian, and 7% of the president's voters were non-Christian religious. And then we look down and we can contrast that to Governor Romney's line. It's a pretty straightforward comparison when you go from the blue to the red, which is, of course, at the bottom of the page. Of the people who voted for Governor Romney, 7% were unaffiliated. And then you get to the orange areas, and look at how the orange area kind of explodes. A whopping 40% of the people who voted for Governor Romney were white evangelical Protestants. And then 17% were white mainliners, 18% were white Catholics. And then you see that the green area shrinks again, it compresses, and 2% of the people who voted for Governor Romney were Hispanic, Asian, and Black Catholics. 1% were Black Protestants, and every time I look at this chart, I always think the same thing, is what did those people say to their friends during coffee hour at church? Maybe they just said, oh, I forgot to vote, you know. So 1% were Black Protestants, 12%, including Mormons, were other Christians, and then you see 3% of the people who voted for Governor Romney were non-Christian religions. And now you're probably thinking to yourself, okay, well, that's really kind of interesting. Historically, it is absolutely mind-boggling in some ways, because this chart that you're looking at right up here behind me is history. If you combine the 2008 and 2012 elections into a single election with 2 cycles, it is the first time ever in the history of the United States where someone became president of the United States without winning the orange people. Barack Obama made history. He became president of the United States without winning a majority of white Christians. That's what the title of the slide is, the end of a white Christian strategy among voters. Now, you can imagine us sitting in Washington, D.C. at the National Press Club with a mixed room of Republicans and Democrats. When that slide went on the board, there was a gasp that rivaled any gasp I've ever heard in a room. People ran down to the front of the room with their smartphone cameras and took pictures of the chart. And then they mailed that chart off to who knows where, newsrooms all over D.C., think tank places. And this chart started a conversation in Washington, D.C. that has not let up since then. You can kind of see the main places of the chart that became very controversial and very public. The first and the quickest conversation that emerged out of the chart was the whole question of Hispanic Catholic voters. And you can see from the chart, if you're interested in politics, that Hispanic Catholic voters are kind of a swing group. And so whoever gets Hispanic Catholics has a pretty good chance of helping to sway elections. There was another conversation that came up. It was on the front page of the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. This was probably last summer when someone suggested that the reason that this all happened is that white men decided not to vote. And that if you could only increase the number of white male voters, that it would all go back to normal. So there you go. I suspect that you have to take away birth control from white women and and wait a while until those babies grow up. But so anyway, this chart inspired a lot of those kinds of conversations. And everybody in the room, being political types, were talking about, what does this mean? What does this mean for the future of the Republican and the Democratic parties? Well, the people who run public religion research had an interesting answer for that. Because there were some people in the room who said, oh, well, look, this is just kind of an anomaly. This is not going to happen again. It's a fluke because you happen to have this really appealing, young, African-American, biracial candidate that got all these other votes. And so this is just, it's unusual. We can't look at this as any kind of trend over time. Well, the people of public religion research are convinced that it's not a trend over time, but that it's actually, or it's not a trend over time, that's the people of public religion research think it's not a fluke, but rather it is a trend that tells us something about the future. And so this is why the rest of the chart is there. Notice that there's not just the red and the blue line. And when I first saw this chart, I was thinking to myself, what are the other lines? The other lines are actually another set of data. It's not data about voters. The only voter data that's on this chart is in the red and the blue line. The other lines are generational lines drawn out of a very large Pew study of 35,000 Americans. And so you'll see on each one of those lines there's two ages, an age bracket, and the top line is 18 to 29. If you go underneath the blue line, you see the next generational line is 30 to 49, and then the next generational line is 50 to 64, and then the next generational line is 65 plus, and then comes the red line for Governor Romney. Those generational lines roughly match millennials, Gen Xers, baby boomers. Now remember, this is 2 years ago, so everybody's 2 years younger. Baby boomers, and then you have a small slice in the 65 plus line of the oldest baby boomers, but it's majority silent generation and greatest generation people who are in the 65 plus line. What public religion research was doing by combining the generational data with the voting data was to try to come up with the average religious age of a Democratic voter and the average religious age of a Republican voter. The average religious age of an Obama voter was 27. the average religious age of someone who voted for Governor Romney was 72. Now, I'm 55. I was born in 1959. I like 72. 72 sounds lots younger to me than it once did. And I'm not going to be 27 again, and I'm pretty far from 27. So it's not that 72-year-olds are bad and 27-year-olds are good. But if you are thinking about cultural change and thinking about the future of a movement or an organization or a political party, you have to be really concerned with 27-year-olds and put your concerns about 72-year-olds in a sort of different institutional slot. So the question was, where is the future? Is this a fluke or is this a trend? And public religion, by putting this chart together in such a way, we're trying to convince the people in the room that although demographics are not completely destiny, demographics are really important. And there does seem to be a generational shift of significant magnitude that is visible in this data. Well, I don't know about you, but when I saw the chart, I'm in the room, and I was in the room for two different reasons. One is that, full disclosure, I am actually on the board of Public Religion Research, so I'm one of the people who helps keep them on track and is accountable for their governance and that they do good work. And that's how come I speak so well of them. I know them from the inside, and I really trust them. I'm very excited to be part of that organization in that governance capacity. So I was in the room for that. But the other reason I was in the room is because I'm just interested in religion. I'm sort of interested in politics in sort of secondary ways. I try not to ever judge anybody on politics. I try to keep it in a sort of what I call an order of loves. And so politics goes down my list. I call it a lesser love. And so I'm interested in politics, but I'm really interested in faith. I'm really interested in religion. And I got a PhD in American religious history. And so clearly I'm passionate about this stuff. So I was there for the data. And as soon as I saw the chart and I understood all that stuff that I was just telling you, what the difference was between the red line and the blue line and all the lines that have just the generational numbers with them, all I could see, the red and the blue disappeared. And all I could see were those generational lines. And I just kept asking myself, sitting in my own corner of the room, not a political person, not working for a political institution, I kept saying, what in the world does this mean for the church? What is this going to mean for the church? And then I thought of something that I know from other places, that the average age in a mainline church is 62 years old. We're on the lower part of the chart in terms of our average age. Although it's not as well known, the average age in a white evangelical church right now is 54. So they're not really all as young as anybody thinks they are. They're only just a few years younger than the average age in mainline churches. What does this mean? And all of a sudden, all kinds of questions and issues and things I'd heard on the road began to make sense to me in new ways. Immediately after getting the chart, it was the next week, I was with a friend of mine who is an Episcopal bishop. And I said, I've got this thing that I can't get out of my mind. I saw it at a meeting last week in D.C., and I want to show it to you. And I pulled the chart out and sat it down in front of him, and I explained a couple little things about it. And I said, what do you think? And he looked at me, looked at the chart. He thought for a couple minutes quietly to himself. And then he looked up and he said, The orange people. It's a trapezoid of despair. And I said to him, oh my gosh, I said, I guess it's only a trapezoid of despair if you're a bishop, and you're worried about like who's going to pay the bills and you're seeing shrinking churches. I said, because I really like you and I thought you would see the same thing on the chart that I saw. And he said, what was that? And I said, all I could think about when I see this chart is all I can think about is the beige people and the green people. And I get so excited when I look at the beige people and the green people. And I think to myself, why did they leave? Why aren't they in church? What kinds of questions are those beige people asking? How are they reordering their lives? I was curious. I wanted to know their story. And then, of course, looking at the green people, I got very excited there too, because I realized that there is still an enormous number of people in the United States, enormous percentage of people in the United States, who are Christian. They're just not all white. Surprise, And I thought to myself, what a remarkable time we live in. Where if we're going to be one, the issue isn't going over denominational boundaries, but rather we need an entirely new kind of ecumenism, an ecumenism that goes over racial, ethnic, cultural, and linguistic boundaries and creates a new kind of unity among the people of God. See, the older kind of ecumenism was to get everybody who was like in charge of a denomination to send a representative to a council. And then you'd have people from all these different denominations sitting around talking about the theological sorts of differences between those groups and how they could cooperate and what they shared in common and what they didn't share in common. It was they were denominational boundaries. But denominational boundaries dissolved all by themselves through most of the 20th century, to where now, for most Americans, and this I'm sure you know from your own experience, I know it from mine, they don't know a Presbyterian from a Lutheran, from a Mormon, from anybody. They don't know the differences in all those names. Most people, if they go to church, which is clearly shrinking, most people, if they go to church, don't pick churches around those in that way anymore. They pick churches because they are related to, that they like the people who are there and think those people can be friends, and that those churches are providing for them some form of meaning that helps them live their lives better. And so the denominational boundaries have already fallen, but look at where those other boundaries are huge. And so when I saw the green resting so close to the orange, but when I show this chart to white people, they always see decline. The first thing most other white people, I'm a white person, but when I show it to people who are my kind, almost the first thing they say is, oh my gosh, look at how few Christians there are. And I say, gosh, look at how we're not seeing what's really right in front of us. And so here we have this enormous picture of the cultural change around religion. And so I talked to my friend who was the bishop about it, and by the time we got through the lunch, he said, I see what you're getting at. Yeah, I was too quick, I was too hasty to see a picture of despair. It's just a picture of change. And boy, can you see it. I showed this to my 16-year-old daughter, who's right off the chart. It's not legal to take surveys, except under very special circumstances of people who are under 18. You have to have adults. So she's right under the chart. And I asked her if this sort of resembled her world. And she showed me a picture from her high school yearbook. She just has her freshman year high school yearbook. She's just finishing up her sophomore year. They haven't gotten their yearbooks yet. And she opens the yearbook up to the page on which her picture is. And there's my daughter, last name Bass. She's 6 foot tall. Oh, she's athletic. She has blonde hair that comes down to her waist, big blue-gray eyes. So she has an English last name, blonde hair, athlete. Looks like the classic California girl, back in the 70s. And there were only 3 girls on that entire page that looked like that. All of the other kids on the page, it was a rainbow of names from around the world. And the skin colors ranged everywhere from her fair white skin to people who were clearly first-generation immigrants from Africa, and every shade in between. There were people who were wearing clothing that marked that they were from other religious traditions and other cultural groups. In her high school, there are 60 languages spoken, and all of these kids are making their way through life together. And so my daughter says, this page looks like your line. And it did. The world that our children inhabit has already slipped forward in my multi-dimensional framework to a place of multiplicity and diversity. And they, as people of faith, are navigating what does it mean. My daughter and my stepson, who's 26, are both navigating what does it mean to be a mainline Protestant Christian person in top-line culture. It is very different than the kind of way I learned to be a Christian in my line. If you look down to where I am on the chart, I'm right there with all those baby boomers, the 50 to 64-year-olds, and you can see how different my line is from her line. The number of people who were unaffiliated when I was growing up was rather small. Interestingly enough, the baby boomer generation, their line grew when they were in their 20s in unaffiliateds. They went up to about 15% of the generation saying they had no religious affiliation. And then when they got a little bit older, the line compressed again, and it steadied for a long time. What is that? 11%, to about 1 out of 10 baby boomers being religiously unaffiliated. My friend who runs this organization tells me there's new research being done, and evidently, and there are a lot of you out there, this is for you, you're having a second adolescence, baby boomers, because your unaffiliated numbers are growing again. And so they're back up to about 15% of your line. I don't know if they'll get bigger or not, but evidently as you retire and you move to places like Tucson and, Jackson Hole and Colorado, where most of you are going for various and sundry reasons. So you're going to Colorado, you're also leaving church again, or you're out there exploring. And so that's an interesting change. But really, it was not nearly as big. Look at the difference. Even at the top of baby boomer unaffiliation or disaffiliation, 15%. Look at the millennials, 35%. 1 out of 3 have no religious affiliation. And then throw in the Gen X line and the senior line, and you can see how things have been changing over several generations. As I've showed this chart to many people, as I said, lots of different kinds of comments and questions have come up. I'm going to just talk about a couple of those, and then I want you to ask me some questions about this chart. There was one woman at an event who was so smart and just incredibly sharp and amazing. She was well into her 80s when she came up to ask a question at a mic, and she said, "Oh, this chart gives me so much hope." And I said, "You know, it gives me a lot of hope too." And she said, "When all those young people grow up, they're all going to come back to church." And that's what she thought it meant. She thought that it meant that you start with no religious affiliation, and then as you get older, you join a church. It does not mean that. As a matter of fact, in that computer, I have several longitudinal studies showing exactly the opposite. That Americans over the last half century, with the exception of the over 65 group, every other generation has gotten more disaffiliated as it ages rather than less. And so this is not the chart that proves that when the young people get married, they're going to come back to church. So that was one sort of misapprehension about the chart, which I really enjoyed. Another moment of this chart that was quite a learning experience for me was when I was with the Protestant Church-Owned Publishing Association. It was held in Nashville. Thank you, United Methodists, for hosting it. The Protestant Church-Owned Publishing Association was founded about, I think, 80 or 90 years ago. And you can imagine, 80 or 90 years ago, who the main members of the Protestant Church-Owned Publishing Association were. Cooksbury, Fortress, Westminster, John Knox, and they were two different things then. They were Westminster and John Knox, not just one. The Episcopal houses of Seabury and Morehouse and Church Publishing and Abington and all the different great church publishers of mainline Protestantism. Well, over the course of that century, the mainline houses consolidated and became somewhat smaller and now make up about 1/3 of the Protestant Church-Owned Publishing Association. And the other 2/3 of the Protestant Church-Owned Publishing Association are mostly evangelical publishers. So this was a room that I was in with mostly evangelicals. And I don't know if any of the people who are here from Cooksbury today were at that event, but they could testify about this happening. It was really fascinating. Probably the most depressed people in the world I know are Protestant church-owned publishers, because they're combining religion with books. And as soon as you put those two things together, that is a challenge that is almost insurmountable. So this was a very depressed room. And I was talking through this data, and they were fascinated by it. And because there were mostly evangelicals there, they were concentrating on the dark orange part, just that part, just the dark orange part. And someone got up, I don't know which publishing house the person was from, Tyndale or one of those places, and he said, "I am shocked by this chart." And I said, "What is that?" And he said, "Look, we have lost all the young adults." And then he pointed out, and if you look at it, you can see it. Look at the slice of the chart that used to be in the white evangelical category, and how from 65 plus, it thins from 28% to 12% of millennials are in that white evangelical category. There are books that are being published at evangelical publishing houses with the titles like The Great Evangelical Recession. That book happens to be black with red print on the front of it, and is probably one of the most frightening books I've ever read about demographics. There's also a great book that a lot of mainliners have read, a book called You Lost Me, which is written from a specifically evangelical perspective, but does have wisdom for people in other churches as well. And this statistic for evangelicals is particularly frightening because of something that has to do about their own religious tradition. And that is, most people, if they become an evangelical Christian, they make that choice by the time they are 22. And so that's why we have Young Life and Campus Crusade for Christ and InterVarsity Christian Fellowship and all those different kinds of youth-oriented movements. They have failed to reach in any significant way the millennial generation. And evangelicals are figuring this out, and they're very frightened by it. The other piece of when they looked at that, and I had never really noticed that because it's not where most of my friends first sort of put their attention on the chart, I immediately kind of went over and I was comparing it to the mainline numbers, which taught me something very interesting. And that is when you ask someone their religious identity in America and they say, well, I'm one of these, I'm part of one of these churches. The white main line, the historically white main line, has gone from 19% with the 65 plus generation to 13% among baby boomers. Hey, millennials or Gen Xers, you don't get any credit, but look at you on that chart. Thank you very much. There's something there that really worked for you in mainline religion, 17%. And then you get to millennials and it's 9%. So in other words, hey, room, you didn't do as badly as you thought you did with your slacker kids and grandkids. Look at the chart. You are the religious group that has lost the fewest people among white folk. So I think that's not so bad. It's a whole different kind of way of seeing where we are. And then, of course, there's this wonderful, wonderful statistic where if you look at the Catholics together, is that my daughter's millennial generation, 5% of her generation are white Catholics, and then just scoot over right next to it to Hispanic Catholics. There are twice as many Catholics of color as there are white Catholics. So 15% of her generation is still Catholic, but is so diverse. And I thought that that was an interesting place in this chart. So as you are looking at the chart in your own seats, from your own perspectives, a whole bunch of different questions and different possibilities arise here. From seeing this as just one snapshot, as it were, of this way in which the culture is changing, the way in which religious affiliation has really radically shifted between the different generations of American adults who are alive today. And I think that it begins to help us to see our neighbor and our neighborhoods in some new ways. I am so glad that it's 2:25 and we have 20 minutes. And that means that I want to hear from you. I don't know what mics are open. Can someone tell me which mics are open that people could make their way towards? Anyone's? Okay. Okay, great. All right, so just make your way to a mic if you want. And there's someone over there. What is that, 15? 5. Okay, 5.
5, which actually has its own Twitter handle during annual conference. So
do you really?
Yeah.
Oh.
Microphone 5 does, so you can follow Microphone 5 on Twitter. A quick question and then a comment. The unaffiliated in the is that all ethnicities or is that only white? The 35% in the I think it was the youngest.
Yeah, in that it's all ethnicities. It's everybody who calls themselves religiously unaffiliated. And one of the things that's interesting at it, if you know the data deeply, and I'm still learning this data deeply because a lot of it is just beginning to come in. The unaffiliateds they have a lot of different things in that category. So there are atheists, there are humanists, there are agnostics, there are people who call themselves seculars, there are spiritual but not religious people, there are people who call themselves post-Christian. There's a whole bunch of stuff. What we do know ethnically about it is that white people are in the majority among atheists and agnostics. But the spiritual but not religious is surprisingly multi-ethnic. And there was a study out just 2 weeks ago from Pew that showed how millennial Hispanics are dropping their percentage of Catholic affiliation, and they're going to 2 places on their own line, and that is they're moving into the unaffiliated category with others of their peer group, and some of them are moving into a category of Hispanic Protestant, which is a difference between this chart and one that came out just recently, where you've now got enough Hispanic Protestants that you can make a separate category of them, not just other Christian. So
one other quick question I wanted to ask.
That's a great question, by the way. Thank you.
That you touch on a little bit. I had coffee. Our church we have a lot of young adults who go to our church, and a comment came up Saturday when I was having coffee with one of them. He's Christian, grew up Christian, dates a woman who was Catholic. I think she's in her late 20s, but also is fascinated by Buddhism. Mm-hmm. And so I'd imagine, I think we're seeing more and more of that kind of people who are jumping all over the scale.
Yes. Oh, and your question leads me to think that there's this other piece in the unaffiliated category that goes right to Twitter handle microphone number 5 over there, and that is, what if you're more than one thing? Where do you put yourself? Remember what I said about modernism? Is that modernism was a belief that there was only one truth and one way, and singular kinds of forms of faith and identity. Now, what happens if a Catholic marries a Hindu and has kids? Back in the old days, people used to say you have to choose. My neighborhood, there are Catholic Hindu 12-year-olds. And they're not choosing. They're actually trying to draw something of wisdom out of both religious traditions. And so those people can't answer the question on the survey. Where do they put themselves? And they come up being unaffiliated because there's no other slot for them. That's a great question. 6, and I'll make my way across the room here. Mm-hmm.
Hi, I'm Julia Shady Armstrong. I'm from Court Street in Rockford. And when I look at that chart, I get kind of excited because when I see that 35% of unaffiliated people, it makes me think of all the people that are just like waiting to be mobilized, because I come from this huge family of atheists, if you could believe it. And here I am at my first church conference. But
You're a rebel.
That was not a conversion. That was a transformation. And every single one of my family members who I have asked to cook a homeless meal or come, my mother came and did a tea at our church, they're always willing. They want religious groups to be authentic and be culturally relevant, and they're just waiting to be moved. And I think we underestimate the power of people being able to find faith and God through doing what we say we're going to do. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's a very promising chart.
Thank you very much for pointing that out. That is wonderful. The beige space is not empty space. It's actually very dynamic space. And there will be people from those beige categories that will decide to move into other forms of religious identification. There will be some people who could convert to being Methodists or any of those kinds of things, but there will be Methodists who also convert to being beige. And so we're in that kind of dynamic moment with all this sense, it's very fluid, of sense of religious identity. And one of the things that we have to figure out how to do is how to have friendships across those lines, and how we work together for larger passions of justice, beauty, and truth, which is something you just proclaimed very nicely there. 4.
Oscar Carrasco from the Elgin District. I was very impressed this morning with what you shared with us, and having been part of working with the Latino community in terms to help them be a part of our family, realizing that as a system we have failed to attract Latinos into our United Methodist Church, we have developed a program intentionally to reach them. But when you spoke about the pre-modern sector, that was very helpful, because there are issues here that we are not able to handle well, and so I want to know if there is some general common denominators, perhaps not only about the Latino immigrant, but African immigrants, that can give us some sort of sense, how do we move forward? More complicated with it is that the third generations of the immigrants or the second generation tend to bypass where we are and perhaps get into the postmodern direction so much easier than the parents, that I just want to know if you have some resources to assist us on that.
Oh, I love your question. Do you have any other part of it? Is that the end of the question? I love it that you have a book going there. That's great. Thank you very much. What did you say your first name was again? Oscar?
Yes, Oscar.
Okay, great. Thank you. On this model that Oscar was asking me about, if I had another Tinker toy, and that's one of the ways I'd carry it around in a modified way if I was doing it a lot on the road, I'd put another little knob here, like this knob, and then I would put another whole long Tinker toy back here for the pre-modern religious consciousness here. What is fascinating to me, that pre-modern people and postmodern people actually share some very significant points of congruence in their frameworks of looking at the world. Pre-modern and postmodern people tend to elevate experience and relationality above other forms of knowing truth. Whereas a modernist person will value things like democratic process or technical solutions to problems or philosophical logic. All go here. And all those things are very good. I don't think that those things should necessarily get thrown out with a historical baby in the bathwater, as we say. But what's happening here is you have cultures of experience and relationality with largely mystical and kinds of supernatural resources in them that are really very powerful. And then out here, that is one of the places where postmodernism is going, is a return to having what the sociologist, Peter Berger said, an enchanted universe. Modernism is sort of the odd duck out of these three worldviews. And yet modernism is the pillar or the basis of most of our institutions. And think about this, if you can even think about it outside of church, this is also a political thing. Congress is a modernist institution that has completely failed. And it's completely failed because it's surrounded by a variety of emerging worldviews that don't fit in the way that Congress does its work. And so Congress keeps trying to fix this while this is happening and this is happening, and these two groups are finding each other and forming new kinds of community and developing new kinds of ways of looking at the world. And these two groups are becoming more disenchanted with institutions all the time, thus adding to the 35%. So your question is absolutely brilliant. And I think that whoever figures out ways of linking institutionally the emphases of experience and relationality of some of the new immigrant groups to the United States with the experience primarily of young adult kinds of communities, that person's going to get a long way in terms of rethinking what church needs to be for the future. You're welcome. I like that question very much. Then 2 and then 1.
Earlier, when you were talking, I was thinking about what I call the Malcolm in the Middle philosophy of "you're not the boss of me," and I was thinking about the millennials and the unaffiliateds, and saying "you're not the boss of me," and whether that's from an emphasis in the established church on the institution and everybody supporting the institution, regardless of how they feel about it, or whether it's about supporting a particular theological or doctrinal position or whatever, that is a part of what's being rejected by many of the unaffiliateds. And at the same time, when you are talking then about, you mentioned Hauerwas earlier, he and others are focused on narrative theology.
Yeah.
And when you talk about sharing the relationality, I'm wondering if the Wesley class meetings or covenant discipleship groups could hold some promise for gathering people together, telling our stories, and comparing them with the greater story of the Christian faith.
Oh, gosh, that's kind of like 2 interesting questions interwoven with one another. I never really watched Malcolm in the Middle. I think it was mostly on TV when my daughter was little. And you know how you lose like 12 years of any kind of relationship with popular culture when you have a little kid, except for Teletubbies. I know a lot about Teletubbies and Blue's Clues because that's when she was little. But that statement, "you're not the boss of me," is both a rejection of institutions that would have authoritative claims on people. But it's also, I think at this point, we could invert it to something positive. I hear coming out of, say, my daughter and my stepson and the various and sundry friends I have that are under 30, which are a surprising amount. And they're now saying, "you're not the boss of me, but we are the boss of us." And so what they've done is they've taken what was initially a rejective kind of claim, and they're creating a new kind of community. And the kinds of communities that they're creating have authority, but that they're networked and woven communities that have no single locus of top-down authority, but instead are multi-nodal kinds of communities that hold people accountable. And so this is a "we are the boss of us" kind of view of institutions. Whatever institution can figure out how to turn that into a structure that is meaningful, you're going to be a really far piece down the road into the 21st century. But all the top-down structures, as Thomas Friedman pointed out, 10 years ago, all of them are disappearing. So that's the first part of your question. And the second part of your question was?
Regarding the Wesley class meetings, and
Thank
whether
you.
they could fill that gap.
Yeah, any kind of gathering that connects people this way instead of this way is going to be a successful sacred space for the 21st century. I don't know what you want to call them. Class meetings, I think, would kind of scare my millennial kids because it sounds like they're going to get graded.
Yeah.
So you might want to think of a new name, but historically I get what you're doing and I love it. We should be repristinating things from the past that will work again, but without being obnoxious about it.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, and question number 1.
Don Dexheimer from Rockford District. Are you aware of any data on marriage that would overlay this
yes.
chart you put up?
I so am. I just got some. There might be somebody in this room who's working on it. As a matter of fact, I don't know that for sure. But one of the most interesting areas of research right now going on with millennials is in the area of marriage. And sometime in the next 2 years, several major studies will be coming out about that, and I've gotten some previews of them. The consensus of those studies is that in this cultural shift, marriage has changed. Now, we all kind of know that, but it's changed in a very interesting way. People from previous adult generations in the United States practiced a form of marriage called cornerstone marriage. And in cornerstone marriage, that meant that people got married when they were at the beginning of their adult life. And so you would find a partner, you would get married, that would be connected to finishing one's education, getting a job, choosing where to live, buying a house, picking a religion, and starting a family. That whole cluster of things happened for most Americans up until fairly recently, between the ages of 17 and 25. And then, out of that cornerstone that you built with that other person, you would then build an entire life. Now, we know, of course, from the experience in the 60s and the 70s that cornerstone marriages could fall apart, and then you'd have to start again, etc. But that's part of the whole history of cornerstone marriage. The average age of marriage in the United States right now is 29 for men and 27 for women. That's the average age. And the marriage practice has shifted from marriage being the cornerstone of building a life to this, and this, if churches get this, boy, again, this is going to move us down the road. Marriage has become capstone marriage. When a person feels like they have sufficiently matured economically, career-wise, friendship-wise, sexually, etc., then the person gets married as a capstone of the young adult experience rather than its beginning. Now, every person who's a clergy person in here knows the difference between cornerstone and capstone marriage, and I would love to hear what the percentages of are people, young adults who present themselves for weddings in your church. How many of them are coming as cornerstone partners and how many are coming as capstone partners? But most of them, I suspect, are coming as capstone partners, not cornerstone partners. We have one of the most dramatic historical examples of it, if you can think about it, and how this has shifted in a generation. Prince Charles and Princess Diana. That was a cornerstone marriage. It was not only a cornerstone of their marriage or their lives together, but it was a cornerstone of the entirety of the British Empire. Well, how well did that work out? But they, the couple was beginning everything from that union, including the furtherance of the British monarchy. Think about this. Princess Diana's son, Prince William, married a woman who is a commoner with whom he had lived for 12 years. Prince Charles was forbidden to marry his young adult lover because she wasn't a virgin. That's what we have in a single generation in the most public marriages in the world. It is a dramatic example of the shift from a cornerstone marriage to a capstone marriage. And with those capstone marriages as well, right now in the United States, 44% of women enter marriage for the first time with their first child. That they've already had their first child or are pregnant with their first child when they enter into a capstone marriage. So when people ask me the question, will they come back once they're married? I just don't even know what to say. Because marriage itself is part of this cultural change. Well, it is time for us to wrap up, but you can see, I mean, honestly, just this simple chart, to put this chart up and to read it deeply, gives us a new set of lenses. Anytime there's data in a room or charts or models, there are always a whole host of different emotions, people who feel loss about how they wish things might be different, or people who feel joy because they're so glad things are changing. But what I've tried to do today is provide to you the best kinds of frameworks that I could provide to help you to see the world as it is. And seeing the world as it is, seeing what is right in front of us, seeing who is on the journey with us, gives us a really interesting opportunity to live well. And we can have a lot of debates about how to do that and what a church should look like in all the midst of this. But what we really can't debate is that it is not 1957. And we have to figure out what it means to be church now, not then. And we can't even really debate what it means to be church then, in the future. We have to figure out how to do it now and anticipate that what we do now, seeing the world as it is now and being faithful in the now, that's going to open up some extraordinary paths for the future. I think, and just my last word to you is I think about those disciples who were on the road with Jesus to Emmaus. And, there's Jesus, and they're walking down the road, and they have a great day together. This guy, this stranger that they met on the road, had really interesting things to say and taught them all kinds of wonderful stuff about God and theology, probably had a few jokes along the way. And then they enjoyed his company so much, they say, hey, come and have dinner with us. And they sit down and they have dinner. And it's when Jesus then blesses the meal and breaks the bread that their eyes are open. And then the scariest thing in the whole story happens. He vanished. So they don't see him until they see him, and then he goes away. And I've begun to wonder about that passage. What is it we're not seeing that we're missing? The joy of an entire day with an unexpected friend. They had a great conversation, but imagine what the conversation would have been if they would have seen who was in front of them the whole day, rather than just the last second of the day. What is in front of us now? What joy, what friendship, what a surprise. What surprise is awaiting us on our road now? Thank you. Thank you so much.
One quick question, Diana. What's the next book and when will it be? Yeah?
The next book is called Grounded, Finding the Spirit of God in the Spirit of the Age. And I've felt very strongly that I needed to look at some of the amazing ways in which the world is changing and try to encourage people of faith not to be afraid of them, but to see where God's active presence is actually in the world and helping us to come to a place of greater depth and beauty in understanding the power of the Holy Spirit.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much.